There is a question that almost every analyst, commentator, and foreign policy expert has been asking since the guns went quiet over Tehran. Did Israel win? It sounds like the right question. It feels like the right question. But it is, in fact, precisely the wrong one. And the reason it is wrong tells you more about the state of the Middle East than almost any answer could. Because the real question, the one that cuts beneath the noise of press conferences and military communiques, is this: who defined what winning even looked like? That answer is not in the ceasefire text. It is buried in 40 years of strategic doctrine, miscalculation, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what Iran actually is. And once you understand that, the events of the past several weeks stop looking like a diplomatic breakthrough. They start looking like the most consequential strategic realignment in the Middle East since 1979. Let us start not with the ceasefire, but with the architecture that made this conflict inevitable. To understand what just happened, you need to understand something that Western media rarely explains with precision. Iran does not think about security the way Western states do. This is not a cultural observation, it is a structural one, and confusing the two has cost policymakers dearly for decades. The Islamic Republic was forged in a specific crucible. It survived an 8-year war with Iraq between 1980 and 1988, a war in which the United States backed Saddam Hussein, in which chemical weapons were used against Iranian soldiers and civilians, and in which the international community offered near silence. Approximately 200,000 Iranian soldiers died. Some estimates go higher. The lesson the revolutionary leadership drew was unambiguous. External powers will always side against Iran when their interests demand it, and the only guarantee of survival is independent strategic depth. That doctrine, what Iranian strategists call the forward defense model, is the origin of everything. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq. These are not separate terrorist organizations loosely affiliated with Tehran. They are components of a single strategic architecture designed to ensure that any adversary choosing to strike Iran must first contend with multiple simultaneous theaters, none of which are on Iranian soil. This architecture took roughly 3 decades and an estimated $15 to $20 billion per year to build and maintain. It has survived the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, its primary architect. It has survived the killing of Hezbollah's Secretary General. It has survived the degradation of Hamas in Gaza. And it has now survived the most intense aerial campaign ever directed against Iranian territory itself. Which brings us to the first thing the conventional narrative gets wrong. The common assumption, repeated endlessly in 2024 and into 2025, was that Iran was weakening. The axis of resistance had been degraded. Hezbollah had taken serious losses. Hamas was under siege. Iran's economy was contracting under sanctions pressure, estimated at costing the country somewhere between $50 and $80 billion annually in lost oil revenue. The supreme leader was aging. Internal protests had rattled the regime. The window, analysts insisted, was closing. And those who wanted to act needed to act now. That assessment was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. And the gap between what it captured and what it missed is where the entire strategic miscalculation lives. What unfolded in the opening weeks of the military campaign was, by any technical measure, extraordinary. The coordination between American and Israeli strike packages targeting Iranian air defense networks, command infrastructure, and nuclear-adjacent facilities represented decades of joint planning made operational. Within the first 72 hours, analysts estimated that approximately 60% of Iran's known surface-to-air missile batteries had been neutralized or degraded. Iranian radar networks were blinded in multiple overlapping zones. The airspace over Tehran itself became, for a brief window, effectively contested. From a purely military standpoint, the operation performed at or above projected parameters. And that is exactly where the problem begins. Because military success and strategic success are not the same thing. They never have been. And the history of the post-Cold War era is littered with campaigns that achieved their tactical objectives and failed at everything that came after. Within days of the opening strikes, 3 simultaneous pressure points materialized that no single military campaign could address. First, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which approximately 21% of the world's traded oil passes, was effectively closed. Iranian naval and missile assets made commercial transit untenable. Insurance rates on vessels attempting passage increased by over 400% within 72 hours. Roughly 17 million barrels of daily oil flow simply stopped moving. Second, Houthi forces in Yemen escalated dramatically, launching a sustained barrage against Saudi and Emirati infrastructure that forced Gulf Cooperation Council members to deploy air defense assets away from any potential role in a wider campaign. The second front activated precisely as designed. Third, and most consequentially, though it received the least media coverage, the economic transmission mechanism began operating at speed. Oil futures markets jumped over 12% in the first week. Aviation fuel costs, already elevated by prior supply disruptions, spiked further. Food commodity prices, already stressed by prior weather events and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, absorbed an additional shock. Central banks in 3 G7 countries issued internal assessments warning that a sustained closure of the strait beyond 30 days would push inflation figures back toward levels last seen during the 2022 energy crisis. Now here's the thing that nobody said clearly in real time, but that will be studied in strategic studies programs for the next generation. Iran did not need to win the air war. Iran needed to make winning the air war cost more than the winning was worth, and that is a fundamentally different objective, one for which 40 years of strategic architecture had been specifically designed. The pivot point, the moment that separates what this conflict was from what it became, did not happen on a battlefield. It happened in an economic calculation. According to reporting from multiple sources close to the negotiations, the shift in American posture did not follow a military reversal. Iranian forces had not achieved anything resembling a conventional victory. What changed was the spreadsheet. The White House economic team was modeling out scenarios in which the strait remained closed beyond 60 days. The numbers that came back were not, to put it diplomatically, politically survivable. A sustained oil shock of that magnitude, layered on top of existing inflation pressures, would arrive in American consumer data, gas prices, grocery prices, housing costs, at a timing that no administration with eyes on electoral cycles could absorb. The strikes had achieved their military objectives. They had not achieved regime change. They had not achieved a negotiated nuclear rollback. They had not achieved the conditions under which any successor Iranian government, even a theoretically more moderate one, would emerge with Western legitimacy intact. And they had activated every economic pressure point the Iranian strategic architecture was designed to activate. So Washington pivoted, not because of military failure, because of strategic cost-benefit math that simply no longer calculated in favor of continuation. That decision, and the speed with which it was executed, is where the story of Israel truly begins. For decades, the cornerstone of Israeli security doctrine has rested on 2 pillars. The first is military superiority, the maintenance of what the Israeli Defense Forces call qualitative military edge, the technical and operational gap between Israeli capabilities and any plausible combination of adversaries. The second is the American guarantee, the understanding, tested and reaffirmed across administrations of both parties, that the United States would stand with Israel at moments of existential decision. What the ceasefire revealed, not through abandonment but through sequencing, is that these 2 pillars are not co-equal, and the subordinate one is not the first. The mechanism through which this became visible was jarring in its specificity. Israeli officials did not simply disagree with the terms of the ceasefire agreement. They reportedly did not have full visibility into the final text before it was announced. An American official, when pressed on this in a briefing, offered a response that, in diplomatic terms, represents an extraordinary statement, acknowledging that Israeli leadership may not have seen the complete agreement while simultaneously framing that as a procedural matter rather than a substantive concern. Let that sit for a moment. Because the subtext of that framing, when translated out of diplomatic language and into plain terms, is that Washington had concluded the Israeli position on the final text was not a variable it needed to optimize for. The agreement served American interests. It was offered to Iran. It was presented to Israel. The Israeli political reaction was, by the standards of coalition politics, unusually unified. Opposition figures from the center-left argued that the moment of maximum pressure had been squandered through overreach. Hawkish voices within the governing coalition argued the opposite, that the deal had extracted insufficient concessions and left the threat fundamentally intact. Security establishment voices, speaking with varying degrees of attribution, raised questions about what the military campaign had ultimately been designed to accomplish. 3 completely different ideological frameworks, 3 completely different criticisms. One shared conclusion: the outcome does not match what was promised. This matters beyond Israeli domestic politics, though Israeli domestic politics matter enormously here, with elections approaching in a context where the political cost of this episode is still being calculated. It matters because it represents the first time in decades that the Israeli political spectrum from left to right has converged on a reassessment of the alliance architecture itself. Not a rejection of the alliance, a reassessment of its terms. That reassessment will shape Israeli strategic behavior for years, and the first consequences are already becoming visible. Here is where we need to pause and examine something that almost no coverage has articulated directly. Because there is a structural logic to the position Israel now occupies that goes beyond the immediate events. A logic that was baked into the strategic architecture of this conflict from the beginning and that the ceasefire has now made explicit. Consider the decision tree that Netanyahu faces in Lebanon specifically. Iranian-aligned forces operating in southern Lebanon have been instructed, according to reporting from multiple regional sources, to maintain strategic restraint, but with one explicit trigger condition: continued Israeli ground presence on Lebanese territory. The ceasefire text calls for cessation of hostilities on all fronts. Israeli officials have stated publicly that they do not consider themselves bound by provisions relating to their operational posture in Lebanon. Now follow the branches. If Netanyahu withdraws from Lebanon, he faces an immediate domestic political crisis. Opposition forces will frame the withdrawal as confirmation that the entire military campaign achieved nothing permanent. If he does not withdraw, Hezbollah has a legitimate trigger, under the terms of the very agreement Washington just signed, to resume operations. If Hezbollah resumes operations, Netanyahu must respond. If he responds with significant force, he risks fracturing the ceasefire that Washington has publicly invested enormous credibility in defending. If the ceasefire fractures, the United States faces a choice between re-engaging a conflict it just ended and watching its most significant recent diplomatic achievement collapse publicly. Every branch of that tree benefits Iran, not through Iranian action, but through the structure of the situation itself. This is the strategic genius, and it is the right word, uncomfortable as it is, of the forward defense model. You do not need to win battles. You need to construct situations where every available response by your adversary advances your interests. Iran did not design this specific ceasefire, but Iran designed over 4 decades the conditions that made this specific ceasefire the most advantageous available outcome. Now we arrive at the load-bearing question, the one that every other element of this analysis ultimately points toward. The issue around which this entire conflict was theoretically organized, the Iranian nuclear program. What the first phase agreement actually does with the nuclear question is, in a word, nothing. The enrichment program is not addressed in the initial text. Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, a level that has no civilian energy justification and sits approximately 1 technical step from weapons-grade material, is not subject to any removal provision in Phase 1. The International Atomic Energy Agency's verification role, which Iran has been restricting with increasing assertiveness since 2021, is not resolved. These questions are deferred to the 60-day negotiating window now underway in Geneva. That window has already produced, by public reporting, at least one near collapse requiring emergency shuttle diplomacy to stabilize. The gap between what Iran is prepared to accept and what the United States considers a minimum verifiable arrangement appears, from available reporting, to remain substantial. And here's the number that matters more than almost any other figure in this analysis. Iran is estimated to currently possess enough enriched uranium to produce, if it chose to pursue weaponization, approximately 3 to 5 nuclear devices, within a time frame that most technical analysts assess at between 6 months and 1 year. That assessment has not changed as a result of the strikes. The enrichment infrastructure that was hit was largely peripheral. The core enrichment capability, hardened, dispersed, and in significant part underground, was not eliminated. So the question the war was supposedly fought to resolve remains open. The country that fought the war has been asked to accept that outcome through a diplomatic process. And the country that survived the war enters that diplomatic process, having just demonstrated, before the entire world, that it can absorb a direct American-Israeli military campaign and emerge with its government intact, its nuclear program operational, and a seat at a major negotiating table. From Tehran's perspective, they have just provided the most compelling possible proof of concept for their survival doctrine. And that proof of concept will shape every negotiation that follows. The Gulf states occupy a position in this analysis that requires careful handling because their public posture and their private calculations are running in opposite directions, and the gap between them tells you a great deal about where the region actually goes from here. Publicly, Gulf Cooperation Council members welcomed the ceasefire. Restored shipping through the Strait of Hormuz was an immediate economic necessity. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 program, the Crown Prince's signature domestic transformation initiative, is structurally dependent on foreign direct investment that requires regional stability. The UAE's positioning as a global logistics and financial hub cannot survive sustained regional conflict. These states needed the shooting to stop. Privately, the picture is more complex. Gulf intelligence and defense establishments have been conducting their own assessment of what the campaign revealed, and what it revealed is both encouraging and deeply uncomfortable simultaneously. Encouraging because American military capability, when fully committed, is genuinely overwhelming in the kinetic dimension. Uncomfortable because what Washington did next demonstrated that kinetic capability does not translate automatically into sustained political commitment. Saudi Arabia has, quietly, been accelerating conversations that were previously theoretical about strategic diversification. These include deepening security cooperation frameworks with countries, including China, that the United States would prefer remain at arm's length from Gulf defense architecture. The conversations are not new. The urgency with which they are now being pursued is. Meanwhile, the Lebanese situation represents a case study in what happens to small states when larger powers negotiate over their territory without them present. The ceasefire agreement includes provisions about Lebanese sovereignty and the withdrawal of external forces. Neither Iran nor Israel considers itself fully bound by those provisions. The Lebanese government, which has spent years attempting to reassert sovereignty over its own territory, was not meaningfully consulted. It is now being asked to implement an arrangement it did not design, between parties that view its territory primarily as a strategic variable. This is not a new experience for Beirut. It is, however, a clarifying one. The Lebanese state, already structurally fragile, economically broken, politically paralyzed, enters this new phase with less leverage, less clarity, and less agency than it had before the conflict began. Pull back to 30,000 feet and three distinct geopolitical lessons are crystallizing simultaneously in three different capitals. They are not the same lesson. They do not point in the same direction. But they are all responses to the same set of events, and together they define the new strategic landscape. In Washington, the lesson being absorbed is simultaneously triumphant and cautionary. The deal is being presented domestically as evidence that American diplomacy, backed by American military power, can create resolution where others saw only escalation. There is genuine truth in that framing. The strait is open. Active strikes have stopped. A catastrophic regional war that could have drawn in multiple state actors and triggered an oil shock severe enough to destabilize multiple economies has been, at minimum, paused. These are not nothing. But underneath the celebration, a harder question is forming in the national security community. What exactly was the theory of change? If the objective was eliminating the Iranian nuclear threat, the program survives. If the objective was regime change, the regime survives. If the objective was demonstrating to regional partners that American commitments are durable, the handling of Israeli consultations raised questions that will take years to answer. The tactical execution was excellent. The strategic endpoint remains undefined. In Tel Aviv, the lesson is more immediately painful. The Israeli security establishment is confronting a question it has spent decades organizing its doctrine to avoid. What does Israeli strategic autonomy actually look like when American preferences diverge from Israeli security requirements? The answer, as of this ceasefire, appears to be that it looks like accepting an outcome you did not want, through a process you did not control, on a timeline you did not choose. That is not the end of the U.S.-Israel relationship. But it is the end of the version of that relationship in which Israeli red lines functioned as effective American policy constraints. The recalibration of Israeli strategy that follows will be significant. It will not be public, and it will involve capabilities and relationships that are not currently visible. In Tehran, the lesson is the most complex of the three, and the most important to understand without romanticizing or distorting. The Iranian leadership is not celebrating a victory in the conventional sense. The strikes caused real damage. The economic costs of the conflict were severe. Specific individuals, including, by multiple accounts, individuals personally close to the supreme leadership, were killed. None of that is nothing. What Iran is absorbing is a proof of concept. The doctrine held. The forward defense architecture performed its function. The adversaries struck and then negotiated. The program survived. And the negotiations now underway offer, at minimum, the prospect of sanctions relief and access to frozen assets estimated at somewhere between $6 and $10 billion. Economic oxygen for a system that was genuinely under pressure. If you are the Iranian strategic leadership, you do not take this as confirmation that you should escalate. You take it as confirmation that the existing doctrine should be maintained, deepened, and adapted, because it just demonstrably worked against the most powerful military coalition ever assembled against you. The Geneva negotiations are not theater, but they are not yet substance either. They exist in the space between, a zone where both sides are simultaneously testing the other's minimums and managing their domestic audiences. And the outcome of those negotiations will determine whether this ceasefire becomes the foundation of a new regional order or the pause before the next escalation cycle. 3 signals will tell you which direction this is heading, and they will be visible before the 60 days expire. The first signal is the uranium question. Watch whether Iran agrees to any arrangement that places verified limits on its enriched stockpile, specifically the 60% material, under an internationally recognized inspection framework. Not agreed in principle, not announced in a press release, verified on the ground, with inspectors who have unannounced access rights. That specific technical arrangement is the thing that cannot be fuzzed with diplomatic language. Either material moves, or it does not. Either inspectors get access they can trust, or they do not. Everything else in a potential nuclear arrangement can be made ambiguous for domestic consumption in Tehran and Washington simultaneously. That one cannot. The second signal is Lebanon. Watch whether Israeli forces begin any meaningful redeployment from Lebanese territory. Not a full withdrawal. That is almost certainly not happening in this time frame. But any movement, any statement of intent with a timeline attached, any engagement with the Lebanese armed forces that suggests a transition rather than an indefinite occupation. The absence of that signal means the Hezbollah trigger remains armed, and an armed trigger in that geography, with the political pressures now operating on Netanyahu, has a historical tendency toward eventually being pulled. The third signal is the most counterintuitive one. Watch the oil price, not as an economic indicator, but as a real-time probability assessment. Markets processing geopolitical risk are, on average, faster and more accurate than official statements from any party in a negotiation. When oil prices stay compressed, the market is assigning low probability to a resumption of active hostilities. When they spike, not on supply disruption news, but in the absence of obvious supply news, the market is pricing an intelligence it is getting from somewhere that is not being publicly disclosed. That spread is often a more reliable indicator of where this is actually heading than anything coming out of Geneva. Here's the conclusion that the conventional narrative is not quite ready to state plainly, but that the evidence points toward with uncomfortable clarity. Iran is, relative to its position before the conflict began, strategically stronger, not militarily stronger. The damage to its air defense networks, command infrastructure, and certain nuclear-adjacent facilities is real and will take years to fully repair. But strategic strength and military strength are not the same thing. And the dimensions that matter most, doctrinal validation, deterrence credibility, negotiating position, regional perception, have all moved in Iran's direction. The regime survived an overwhelming campaign by the world's most powerful military alliance. It activated every economic lever in its strategic architecture precisely when designed to be activated. It forced a negotiation it had previously been told would not happen until it made far larger concessions. It enters that negotiation with its nuclear program intact, its deterrence architecture demonstrably functional, and the knowledge, now publicly demonstrated, that its adversaries will choose economic cost management over the sustained application of force required for decisive outcomes. That knowledge is permanent. It will inform Iranian decision-making across administrations, across supreme leaders, across every future crisis in which the question of how far Washington will actually go is relevant, which is to say, every future crisis. This is not an argument that the ceasefire was wrong. Stopping active strikes that were generating unsustainable economic costs while failing to achieve their stated political objectives was, by the available logic, the correct call. But correct tactical decisions can coexist with structural strategic losses. And the inability to hold both of those things simultaneously, to acknowledge that something can be the right immediate choice and still represent a meaningful deterioration in long-term position, is one of the persistent failure modes of Western strategic communication. The deal stopped a war. It did not settle a conflict. Those are two entirely different things. And the next chapter of this story will turn entirely on whether the parties involved, and the analysts, the policymakers, and the publics watching, are honest with themselves about that distinction. 60 days from now, one of two things will be true. Either the Geneva negotiations will have produced a verifiable arrangement that genuinely addresses the nuclear question, an outcome that would represent the most significant arms control achievement of the past 2 decades, and that would, in retrospect, justify the entire painful arc of this conflict as the pressure that made agreement possible. Or they will have produced a document that is sophisticated, carefully worded, diplomatically successful, and strategically hollow, a framework that allows every party to claim victory for domestic audiences, while deferring the unresolved questions into the next crisis cycle. The history of Middle East diplomacy suggests the second outcome is more probable. The complexity of this specific moment, the personal stakes in Tehran, the political pressures in Tel Aviv, the economic incentives in Washington, the structural trap in Lebanon, suggests that producing a genuinely transformative agreement in 60 days would require a convergence of political will, technical concession, and strategic honesty that rarely materializes under this much pressure. But history is not destiny. Structural traps have been escaped before. Doctrines that seemed permanent have been abandoned. Leaders facing existential domestic pressure have sometimes made exactly the kind of bold concession that changes trajectories rather than just extending them. What we know right now, with certainty, is that the Middle East that emerges from the Geneva process, whatever it produces, will not be the Middle East that entered this conflict. Something has shifted in the assumptions underneath the regional order. The question of what it has shifted toward is the most important open question in geopolitics today. Watch Geneva, watch Lebanon, watch the oil price. Watch what Netanyahu does when the domestic pressure peaks and he has to choose between political survival and alliance discipline. Watch whether Iran's new supreme leader decides that a partial deal today is worth more than a complete deal that might never come. The ceasefire signed in the past weeks ended an active military campaign. It did not end the conflict that produced it, and the most consequential decisions in this story have not yet been made. That is where this stands. And it is almost certainly not the last time we will be asking what Iran emerging stronger actually means for the world.